Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating historical archetype to look at something that honestly affects almost all of us. We're talking about how proximity creates these incredibly subtle patterns of long-term character decay. We'll be looking at the anatomy of drift and how just being near the truth, well, it isn't always enough to actually keep you anchored to it. So let's dive right in with a super compelling question. How does a good person lose their way without ever intentionally turning back? Like, how does that actually happen? To figure this out, we're going to trace the life of an ancient figure named Lot. We'll start right in the warm, gold and olive green fertile valleys of his youth, just to see exactly how character decays over time. Let's start with part one, borrowed direction and proximity. So what exactly is borrowed direction? Well, it's basically following a path based on your proximity to someone else's calling rather than having your own internal anchor or alignment. And our story begins with a man whose early life is defined entirely by his nearness to someone else. Lot grows up under his uncle Abraham's covering. He kind of just inherits proximity to a great promise. When Abraham travels, Lot travels. When Abraham prospers, Lot prospers. But he's really just tagging along, right? He has no initiated direction of his own. His whole identity is shaped purely by nearness. And that leads us to this really profound takeaway. Proximity is absolutely not the same thing as alignment. You can be incredibly close to the truth, literally surround yourself with it every single day, and yet remain completely unanchored to it. And this sets the absolute perfect stage for that subtle, long-term character decay we're talking about. Moving on to our next section, the choice of sight, or judging by appearance. So eventually, growing wealth causes some pretty severe tension between their camps. Abraham humbly offers Lot the first choice of land, and when he's finally forced to make a choice, Lot just lifts his eyes to the Jordan Valley. Now, ancient texts draw a fascinating comparison here. They say the valley looks like Eden, the ultimate symbol of lost perfection, but also kind of like Egypt, which represented this purely human system of provision and security. Basically, he's evaluating his entire future purely on external metrics of success. I mean, the valley is well-watered. It practically screams security and abundance, but his choice is made completely by sight. There's literally no reference to God's direction or any kind of deeper calling here. And this is crucial. Lot isn't intentionally choosing evil. He's not rebelling. He's simply choosing what looks best, based entirely on surface-level appeal, without ever stopping to ask what is actually true. Which brings us to section 3, the anatomy of drift and gradual decay. Now notice how perfectly this maps out a slow, incredibly subtle descent. Step 1, he simply chooses the plane. Step 2, he pitches his tents just near Sodom. Step 3, he's actively living in Sodom. And finally, step 4, he's actually sitting at the gate of Sodom. You see, this wasn't some overnight jump. It was a gradual slide from merely camping near a corrupt environment to literally holding a seat of civic authority within it. Okay, to really grasp the gravity of this, we kind of have to reframe how we view this city. Sodom wasn't some cartoonish villain's lair. It had all the external markers of a wildly successful Bronze Age metropolis. We're talking massive limestone walls, super busy wealthy merchants, luxurious homes. But right alongside those shiny external markers of success was this rotting internal decay. Moral inversion, social corruption, and just aggressive disorder. Cruel corruption was completely normalized. It was just viewed as the cost of everyday success. As the saying goes, drift is rarely immediate. It is gradual, proximity, comfort, normalization, participation. Lot doesn't start out as a man of Sodom. No way. But over time, the environment exerts this intense pressure. And a divided soul, a guy with borrowed direction, well, he simply adapts to his surroundings to survive. All right, section 4. The crisis of environment. Judgment comes. The narrative tone in our source texts really shifts darker here. Think smoke and firelight, when a literal and metaphorical judgment finally comes knocking on the city's door. Lot faces this severe crisis when an aggressive mob threatens angelic guests staying with him. And guys, it's a tragic case of righteous intent completely trapped within a corrupted framework. In this genuinely shocking moment of distorted moral reasoning, Lot tries to protect his guests by offering his own daughters to the violent mob. I mean, he's trying to do the right thing, but he's processing it through a completely corrupted moral framework. It really shows just how deeply his environment has warped his internal compass. So, as the city faces absolute imminent destruction, and he's told to run, the text uses, honestly, one of the most revealing phrases possible to describe Lot's reaction. he lingers. Which completely begs the question, why on earth does a righteous man hesitate to leave his own destruction? This hesitation, it proves that his identity has become deeply, profoundly entangled with the exact place that is collapsing around him. He knows he should leave, but his attachments? They're just incredibly strong.
The angels literally have to physically grasp his hand. He is pulled away. This is definitely not a willing escape. He leads a household that is deeply divided by attachment. And tragically, his wife looks back, frozen in regret. It proves a pretty devastating point. Righteousness alone doesn't guarantee clarity or strength. Without active alignment, you just become a passive participant in your own life, getting dragged out of the fire while still holding on to a destructive attachment.
Let's look at Section 5, a legacy of divergence. This is where personal tragedy becomes generational. Leaving the ashes of Sodom behind, we enter the cold, gray silence of a mountain cave. In total isolation, believing the world has literally ended, Lot's daughters act out of profound fear and completely distorted reasoning. This fearful union results in the birth of Moab and Ammon. These relatives will diverge from Israel. They'll settle just east of the Jordan, close to the promise, for sure, but not in it. And eventually they emerge as entire nations defined by a pattern of resisting Israel. You see, they share Israel's history, but they absolutely do not share their covenantal calling. This legacy of drift, it manifests into two distinct nations with two defining distortions. Moab destabilizes Israel through subtle spiritual seduction, basically influencing them toward idolatry rather than attacking them head-on. Ammon, on the other hand, well, they represent hostility and boundary violation, culminating in a severe, destructive inversion, where life, even children, is violently sacrificed just to sustain a corrupted system. So what begins as personal proximity scales up into a national pattern of long-term character decay. These nations vividly show what happens when nearness to the truth isn't matched by surrender and alignment. They're basically acting out, on a grand national scale, the exact same tragic patterns of their father Lot, proximity without any true commitment.
And that brings us to our final section, the archetype of compromise. The contrast between the two men who started this journey together, it's incredibly stark. Abraham walks by faith, actively refuses Sodom, and literally shapes the future. Lot chooses by sight, passively adapts to his environment, and barely even survives his own choices. Abraham's life is defined by intentional alignment. Lot's is defined by environmental drift.
But the source material doesn't end in total darkness. Actually, as a sort of pale sunrise breaks the narrative, we see a real ray of grace interrupt this vicious cycle. Ruth, a direct descendant of Moab, steps into the story. She intentionally aligns herself with truth, eventually joining the messianic lineage. It just goes to show that even a deeply compromised line can be completely redeemed. So I'm going to leave you with this final, really vital question to think about. In the absence of intentional alignments, is your environment becoming your guide? Because as we've seen today, proximity alone just isn't an anchor. What subtle drift is currently shaping who you are becoming? Thanks for exploring this fascinating historical archetype with me.